Medieval history is often wrapped in myths, romanticized tales of knights and castles, and grim imagery of disease and war, but the reality was far more fascinating and layered than most people realize. For example, did you know that many peasants actually worked fewer hours than the modern-day 9-to-5 employee, unlike today's rigid schedules? Medieval laborers, especially during the non-harvest seasons, often worked in short bursts, followed by long breaks with Sundays and over 80 holidays off. Another shocking truth is that castles were not always the grand, pristine fortresses shown in films. Many were damp, cold, and constantly under renovation, and rather than living in royal luxury, nobles shared rooms with servants and had little privacy. Hygiene, too, wasn't completely ignored, as is often believed. People bathed regularly using public bathhouses, which were common in cities like London and Paris until the Black Death and moral panic shut many of them down. Speaking of the plague, it's surprising to learn that some medieval cities handled the pandemic with remarkable efficiency, setting up early forms of quarantine and contact tracing. Another misconception is that people thought the earth was flat. In fact, educated scholars since ancient Greece knew it was spherical, and medieval academics taught this in universities founded as early as the 12th century in places like Bologna, Oxford, and Paris. These universities themselves were surprisingly advanced, offering degrees in law, medicine, and theology, and hosting vibrant intellectual debates. The myth that the medieval church stifled all scientific progress is also misleading. Monasteries preserved classical texts, translated Arabic science, and even promoted early experiments in fields like optics and astronomy, while women had limited rights. Some did rise to prominence in surprising ways, from Hildegard of Bingen, who was a respected philosopher, composer, and healer, to Eleanor of Aquitaine, who wielded immense political power and went on crusade with her husband. Women also dominated certain trades, such as brewing, midwifery, and textiles. Literacy rates, while low, weren't non-existent. Even peasants sometimes sent their children to local church schools, and storytelling through oral tradition was vibrant and preserved through minstrels and poets. Food, too, was more diverse than we think. Medieval cooks used spices like cinnamon, cloves, and saffron, especially among the wealthy, and people enjoyed exotic imports thanks to trade routes stretching into the Islamic world and Asia. There's also the surprising fact that medieval London had a form of waste management with public latrines and even early sewer systems. Though far from perfect, they were attempts at urban sanitation. Many people believe medieval folk rarely traveled, but pilgrimages, fairs, and seasonal work made travel common, with roads linking major cities and inns. Along the way, even passports of a sort existed in the form of travel permits. Another stunning fact is that knights weren't always chivalrous. Many were ruthless mercenaries or land-hungry nobles, and tournaments were often deadly, not the sanitized jousts we see in movies. Armor was also not as clunky as believed, with well-made plate armor allowing considerable mobility and even acrobatics. What's more is that the medieval period saw vibrant cross-cultural exchange thanks to the Crusades, Islamic Spain, and trade with Byzantium and the Middle East, resulting in the transfer of knowledge in medicine, mathematics, and philosophy. Even glasses were invented in the 13th century in Italy and improved reading accessibility. Religious life, too, was multifaceted. Monks were not all solemn and silent. Some played musical instruments, kept pets, or brewed beer, and nuns often administered schools and hospitals. Architecture flourished in the Gothic period, with innovations like flying buttresses, stained glass, and vertical cathedrals reaching for the heavens. Many towns had guilds which regulated trade-trained apprentices and provided social welfare for their members. Medieval people also enjoyed games from chess and backgammon to dice and football, which resembled a chaotic street battle more than today's sport. The Black Death, though tragic, brought labor reforms, empowering surviving workers to demand better conditions and wages. The 100 Years' War introduced longbows and gunpowder, changing the face of warfare forever, and the printing press, invented in the late medieval period, revolutionized the spread of knowledge. The medieval period also saw the creation of legal systems such as English common law and the codification of canon law, which still influence modern law today. Another surprising fact is that animals were sometimes put on trial in medieval courts, complete with lawyers and judges, especially in cases involving livestock or pets that caused harm. Art and music also flourished, with illuminated manuscripts, sacred chants, and eventually secular ballads, telling stories of love, loss, and heroism. Stained glass windows weren't just decoration, they were the television of the age, conveying biblical scenes and moral lessons to a largely illiterate population. Architecture in cities like Bruges or Venice displayed surprising opulence, showing that wealth wasn't confined to kings alone. Even children had a distinct presence in society with toys, games, and songs tailored to them, and education was not unheard of, with grammar schools preparing some boys for clerical or university paths. The concept of romantic love began evolving during the medieval period, with courtly love poetry and the ideal of the noble lady influencing literature and relationships more than we give credit for. Economic life was not static either, as bustling markets, fairs, and trade routes from the Silk Road to the Hanseatic League linked Europe to the wider world. Money lending, banking, and accounting also developed during this time, especially in Italian cities like Florence and Genoa. Jews, despite persecution, were key players in finance, medicine, and scholarship, contributing to medieval society despite facing severe restrictions and expulsions. Another important but lesser-known fact is the role of minority communities like Moors in Spain or the Slavs in Eastern Europe, who had dynamic cultures and political systems. The use of heraldry, flags, and family crests helped define identity and lineage. Long before ID cards and signatures, while people feared witches, they also believed in fairy spirits, saints, and healing charms. Blending Christianity with ancient folklore, holidays like Christmas and Halloween were rooted in both pagan and Christian customs, blending traditions in ways we still celebrate today. Lastly, the myth that the Middle Ages were completely dark is misleading. The era laid the foundations of modern Europe in law, education, architecture, and cultural identity, revealing that the so-called Dark Ages were filled with surprising light, curiosity, and resilience in ways few expect until they truly explore the 100 surprising facts that reshape everything we assume about medieval life. Continuing from the hidden layers of medieval history, there's much more to uncover that changes everything we assume about the era. For instance, the image of medieval people being overly superstitious and blindly religious is overly simplified. While faith played a central role in daily life, many thinkers questioned religious authority, debated theology, and even criticized corruption in the church. Long before the Reformation, figures like John Wycliffe and Jan Hus were early reformers who faced persecution for challenging the status quo. Another surprise lies in medieval fashion, where both men and women wore vibrant, colorful clothing dyed with natural sources like woad madder and saffron. And some nobles even wore pointed shoes and extravagant hats to show wealth and status. Sumptuary laws were introduced in several countries to prevent commoners from dressing like the elite. The medieval world also embraced global trade in ways we rarely imagine. Merchants from Venice and Genoa traded with the Islamic world, China, and India, bringing in goods like silk, sugar, spices, and porcelain. The Silk Road and maritime routes were lifelines of commerce and culture, allowing medieval Europe to access exotic products and ideas. While knights are often romanticized as the ultimate warriors, peasant soldiers often formed the backbone of medieval armies, with weapons like pikes and longbows, and they proved decisive in battles such as Agincourt, where English archers devastated French cavalry with superior tactics. Even the Vikings, though typically associated with violence, were skilled traders, settlers, and explorers who founded cities like Dublin and ventured as far as North America. Centuries before Columbus, the medieval period was also home to unique inventions such as mechanical clocks, windmills, watermills, and advanced irrigation systems, improving agricultural productivity and urban life. The myth That women were entirely powerless is challenged by records of female merchants, abbesses, queens, and even warriors like Joan of Arc, who led French troops to victory and inspired a nation at just 17 years old. While torture and executions did occur, public punishments often had a theatrical element aimed more at shaming than inflicting pain, with stocks, pillories, and symbolic penance robes used in many cases rather than outright violence. Legal systems were surprisingly complex, with courts, witnesses, juries, and even appeals, and not every conflict ended in bloodshed. Many cases were settled through negotiation. Compensation, or oaths. Education was more widespread than assumed, with monasteries, nunneries, and cathedral schools educating not just boys but sometimes girls as well, especially in noble or merchant families. People learned Latin, arithmetic, music, and basic law, while monastic scriptoria preserved thousands of ancient texts by copying manuscripts by hand. Cities like Córdoba in Islamic Spain were multicultural hubs where Christians, Muslims, and Jews coexisted, sharing knowledge in philosophy, astronomy, and medicine, and the libraries of Baghdad and Toledo became bridges between ancient wisdom and European scholarship. Alchemy, though often mocked today, was a serious pursuit blending science, religion, and philosophy, and it laid the groundwork for modern chemistry. Another startling fact is that the medieval worldview included a deep respect for nature, animals, and the cosmos, with bestiaries combining moral lessons with descriptions of real and mythical creatures. Many people used herbs and traditional remedies for healing, and some midwives and herbalists developed impressive knowledge passed down over generations. While the feudal system is often portrayed as static, social mobility was possible, especially through the church, trade, or battlefield success. Many serfs gained freedom by moving to towns or through service to a lord. Medieval entertainment included plays, festivals, music, feasts, and tournaments often open to the public, where stories of saints, legends, and moral lessons were dramatized. Guilds provided not only economic support but also cultural life through patronage of the arts and public celebrations. Urban architecture in towns like Prague or Nuremberg featured stunning Gothic designs, narrow cobbled streets, and community squares that are still admired today. Medieval art wasn't limited to religion either. Secular themes appeared in tapestries, carvings, and paintings, and artists explored perspective, narrative, and symbolism with increasing sophistication. Astrology, too, was taken seriously, with scholars drawing detailed charts and kings consulting astrologers before making major decisions. While disease was a constant threat, hospitals were established by religious orders to care for the sick, and some towns employed physicians, surgeons, and even early forms of medical licensing. The famous plague doctors with bird-like masks came much later, but their roots lay in these early institutions. Love and marriage were also more complex than assumed. While arranged marriages were common, love matches did happen, and courtship rituals, poetry, and gifts were part of the romantic tradition that evolved over time. Rural communities maintained strong bonds through shared labor, seasonal festivals, and local customs, while the church influenced morality. Folk traditions and village rituals remained powerful, from maypoles to harvest dances. Despite frequent wars, life was not always violent. Many regions enjoyed long periods of peace, prosperity, and local autonomy, and castles functioned more as administrative centers than battle stations. People valued humor, wit, and storytelling, with jesters, minstrels, and traveling performers entertaining crowds in town squares and royal courts. Pilgrims not only traveled for religious reasons, but also for adventure, healing, or personal transformation, and famous routes like the Camino de Santiago brought together people from all over Europe. The use of written contracts, deeds, and wills increased literacy among the merchant and noble classes and signaled the rise of bureaucratic institutions. Universities developed student guilds, textbooks, and lecture systems that shaped higher education for centuries. The idea that all books were chained to tables in monasteries is inaccurate. Many texts circulated among scholars and were read aloud to groups, allowing even the illiterate to access stories, knowledge, and news war, while destructive also spurred innovation in fortification logistics and diplomacy and medieval. Diplomacy involved treaties, marriages, and alliances that could shift the fate of kingdoms with a single signature. Chivalry as an ideal promoted honor, loyalty, and protection of the weak, but its reality was far messier, often used to justify power and conquest. Exploration was not limited to Marco Polo or the Crusades. Scandinavian, Russian, and Arab travelers left detailed records of journeys through Asia, Africa, and Europe. Economic innovation included double-entry bookkeeping, banking institutions, and merchant guilds that laid the groundwork for capitalism and financial networks that still function in some form today. Another rare fact is that many medieval people kept pets, including birds, cats, and dogs, which were sometimes buried with them, showing emotional bonds across species. While Christianity dominated Europe, local saints, relics, and shrines formed a colorful patchwork of belief, with pilgrim badges and souvenirs being early forms of religious merchandise. Medieval seafarers understood tides, winds, and stars well enough to reach distant coasts, and their ship designs, like cogs and caravels, set the stage for later global exploration. Finally, the greatest surprise is how much of what we know as modern education, law, medicine, architecture, storytelling, finance, and human rights emerged in seeds during the medieval centuries, proving that far from being a dark age, it was an era of profound curiosity, resilience, and cultural growth that continues to shape how we live, think, and connect today.